Welcome to the Point of No Return podcast, a show at the intersection of technology and strategy. On this show, we interview industry leaders and experts to better understand how they think about strategy during this time of exponential progress.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of the Point of No Return podcast. On today's show, I had the pleasure of speaking with Helge Seetzen, CEO at TandemLaunch. TandemLaunch is a unique startup foundry. It has a really interesting model, if you haven't heard about it, in Montreal. A little bit on Helge's background. He's an award-winning technologist, entrepreneur, and recognized global authority on technology transfer. As General Partner of TandemLaunch, he works with inventors and entrepreneurs to build high-growth tech companies, and we dig into this unique model quite a bit. Some of his past successes include the transformation of raw university IP into fully commercialized LED TV technology, including selling his last company, which was called Brightside Technologies, to Dolby after sealing a partnership with some of the world's largest consumer electronics companies. Helge holds also over 60 patents in the fields of display, camera, video technology. As you can imagine, Helge has a pretty interesting track record, and we dove into it quite a bit. He also had some really great advice, I think, for any entrepreneur, be it early stage or not. We spoke about how he launched his first companies, how he fell in love with building new technology, the opportunity that he saw in academic research and tech startups, and basically the mind meld between these two, the importance of having a feedback loop for a management team. Something I really enjoyed is the concept of making decisions with a dynamic range. And then finally, we spoke about what he's thinking about in the industry, the technologies that he's excited about. Helge is building companies that are truly shaping the future. I was really fascinated by Helge's approach, his background, and his startup incubator. I really hope that you'll enjoy the conversation. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to catch up again. I'm really happy that you took the time in your offices. It looks like you guys have expanded from what I understand.
We have quite a bit, yeah.
So, like I said, I'm really happy. I guess my first question I would ask you, Helge, would be, what was your PhD on?
Quite a few different things. So I had a bit of a unique PhD in that I had 4 supervisors in physics, computer science, electrical engineering, and psychology. I see from your facial expression, the psychology part is a bit of a glitch, but don't come to me for counseling. This was visual neuroscience. So it all had to do with basically building displays. So really, I built my second company during my PhD, and the company developed what is now known as HDR displays, LED TVs. And so my PhD was centered all around the skill sets you needed to build a full functioning display. So the hardware, the software, the optics, and the visual perception thereof.
Well, I have to give you credit just for 4 supervisors. I have to say, I can imagine having to manage 4 people. So yeah, hopefully the supervisor in psychology gave you tips.
Absolutely, yeah. No, it was an interesting exercise. But again, I was really primarily. So I was full-time running and building this company, and the PhD was really an activity on the side, and so which added to the load. So there's managing 4 different supervisors, 4 different degree programs, all while building a company was an interesting challenge.
What got you interested in that particular field? Like, why displays? Was there obviously you're at your PhD level, so you've studied in the field, but you're curious?
Yeah, it was more of a continuation. So I. In my undergrad, right when I started, I was an immigrant in Canada. I'm from Germany originally, and I didn't have a work permit, so I couldn't really work anywhere. And I was broke, and so I was trying to find some way to get involved. And the only thing that the study permit allowed you was to work a little bit of time in the academic context on campus. And so I ended up working in a laboratory that happens to be building electronic displays, and so I got involved in a project that built an electronic paper display, sort of like the Amazon Kindle. And that actually became a spin-out that I was a founder of. And then that was during my undergrad. And then we split the company later. The electronic paper display stuff is actually still an active company in Vancouver. This was at UBC. And the other half became my effectively second venture, which then overlapped into the PhD. So I was working all this stuff for years, building multiple companies before I even entered my PhD. So the choice of topic was really just a continuation of my my entrepreneurial career rather than my academic career.
Did you always think that you were going to be an entrepreneur? Did you always think that as a young kid that, hey, I'm going to start and launch these massive companies at one day?
No, I didn't even know what that word means. So I grew up in a very small village, 200 people, 5,000 cows, where these are real statistics. You laugh, but that's pretty much what the
I can relate.
was.
Yeah, my parents come from a really small village in Greece where I think there was technically more sheep than people.
Yeah, so I come from a very small community. In Germany, where entrepreneurship, at least at that time, really wasn't a topic, and so honestly, I didn't even know how this whole works. I'd never. Both of my parents, we have nobody in our family tree that's gone to universities. We have nobody that finished high school, right? So there was no mental model of do a PhD and start a tech company. It was so far out of our cultural horizon, that I had not the slightest idea. I just moved to Canada to study, and the rest sort of were a lot of opportunistic branches that I took in my path that worked out.
Yeah. So there's nothing, I guess, in your early age where you thought about it, but there must have been some kind of internal drive, right? Some kind of like curiosity or something that led you to say, hey, like there's something that needs to exist and I need to make this happen.
Yeah. I tend to be somebody who, I'm not a big life planner. I don't sit down and write down like what I want to be in 20 years. I'm fairly opportunistic. And I fall in love easily. Like anybody who works with me will tell you that I fall in love with technology. I fall in love with entrepreneurial people. I fall in love with ideas, with visions, very quickly and very profoundly. And then sometimes I get my heart broken, but usually it works out. And so quite often I just come across something that I think is just, this is just lovely. This would be great for the world to have. This is a cool idea. Let's do something with it. And those become the genesis moments of creating companies, rather than sort of a deeply strategic game plan of, there's a market and let's do this. Now, fortuitously, I happen to be reasonably good at that. So I don't get my heart broken as often as I get reasonable successes. But it really just, there wasn't much of a game plan.
Yeah, I love that reason of if there's love, there's a way.
Absolutely.
So in the early part of your career, it looks like you launched Sunnybrook and Brightside, both out of UBC. What are the key learnings from launching those two companies?
Startups is hard. So there's all sorts of things I've learned, but a few of them are, work with good people. A lot of them are platitudes, right? Work with good people. Try to maybe something that's a bit more profound is one thing that my co-founder, mentor, the professor I worked with early on, told me at some point was try to understand the dynamic range of the system that you're in. So this is very much a physics professor talking. But one of the things I find that a lot of entrepreneurs, and these days for a living, I work with entrepreneurial aspiring leaders and so forth, that a lot of people have a really not a good feeling for is the dynamic range of the system and environment they're in. So here's what I mean by that. Simple example. Lots of entrepreneurs will fret over dilution in financing, or they will fret over how many extra stock options they get, or they will fret over, budgetary questions, things like that, right? And very few look at this from a dynamic range perspective. Like, for example, in the financing, what's the dynamic range of a financing, of dilution, right? So if it's a great financing, you get 20% dilution. If it's a horrible financing, you get 40% dilution. That's it. The dynamic range is 2 to 1, right? It's a very tiny dynamic range. Whereas other decisions that you're making, such as, which exit path to pursue, or will often have a dynamic range of like 20 to 1, 30 to 1, 50 to 1, right? And so when you go through life as an entrepreneur, you're going to be forced making decisions all the time. And the emphasis should be on the decisions that have high dynamic range. They should be on the decisions that have big potential for impact, because the little stuff doesn't end up doing anything. When we sold Brightside, I remember there were lots of moments where we hired this executive and we have to give him a package, and that had a non-trivial dilutive impact on me. And then we had to raise multiple. We raised 9 rounds of financings at different stages, and stock option plans were created. There's all these decisions that influenced what I owned, but it was all low dynamic range stuff, right? And then there were the big decisions, and they had like a 300x impact, doing the right versus doing the wrong. And so life becomes a lot easier if you focus on the stuff that actually matters. And you can really think of this, at least as a physicist, in terms of really the range of outcomes, right? And the stuff that had low range of outcome, just don't worry about it so much. Yeah.
Do you use any kind of like methodology or process either for yourself or for maybe when you coach entrepreneurs on how to approach that? Is it just like time spent in terms of like your percentage of the week of your time, or is there a more thoughtful, deliberate way to look at it?
Yeah, so it's more mind share. So it's not so much time. Like time is just effort, right? It's more mind share. Like people can say, "Oh, I'm not spending time on this," but if they're thinking about it every day, it takes mind share away from it, right? And as an entrepreneur, most of the time, as an entrepreneur, you don't become successful by investing time. You become successful by investing mindshare, right? Time is like I sit down and I type emails or I write text or I write code or whatever. That's all useful, but you're just working like any other employee of your startup. That's not going to make the company successful. So you want to put your mind to work. You want to share mindshare. The tough part with mindshare is that you can never get more. You have as much as you have. And from whatever you have, you subtract all the stuff that occupies your mind. And so what I try to do these days, and have tried for my whole career, is deliberately sort of offload from my mind, stuff that, that can go away. You know, the first list of stuff is obviously the things that can go away that you can just bang out easily and you solve them and be done. But usually that's not a long list, right? The second layer that I really deliberately try to do, and I'm not always successful, is to go, okay, well, this thing, whether it goes great or good, you know, it goes great, good, or crappy, the dynamic range is only 2-to-1 and the impact isn't that big. So just ignore it. Delegate it, let somebody else handle it. Worst case, they come back, they screwed it up, we get the bad outcome. It's not all that different from the good outcome. Let's not sweat it, right? Let's focus my mind share on the stuff that can have a big impact.
Yeah, the stuff that can be 10 to 100x, like you said.
Exactly. And entrepreneurship, more than most professions, is full of those 100x decisions, right? And you can get completely preoccupied with the little stuff. I see this, you know, a lot of entrepreneurs that I coach in a variety of roles, whether it's at TandemLaunch, whether it's the Creative Destruction Lab, the Dobson Cup. I work on a lot of initiatives where I end up coaching entrepreneurs. Some of them, you know, not just occupy their mind share fully with like small dynamic range stuff. They have fights over it, squabbles, burn bridges, conflicts with investors, all that stuff, only to emerge at the very end with like, haha, I got dilution down from 30% to 28% or something. Meanwhile, I've ruined the future. So great. I've not paid attention to anything strategic. I burned all my bridges and here I am. I own fraction of 2 points more. And it's just not very strategic to do that.
It's like another variation of focusing on what's important, but I find it's a much more deliberate way of looking at it, right? Because maybe raising around and dilution is important, but it's not ultimately what will have the greatest impact for the company.
Correct. And this, I just use this because I'm a VC, but the same is true for like contracts, for example. Like the number of times people come in and they go like, oh, you know, I want to have, you know, in my contract that I'm negotiating, I want to have this clause. And then they end up getting very fixated on this rather than just getting the deal done, right? And so let's get it done, give or take. It doesn't mean that I agree to everything. There are certain things that have higher dynamic range. I try to make sure the things that have, the stuff that has high dynamic range are things like uncapped liabilities and contracts, things like that. You want to make sure those are contained. But the small stuff, you know, whether some deal is at $15 an hour or $16 an hour, or whether it's this or that, like whatever in the context of the negotiation is a narrow dynamic range, it's usually not worth it, right? You're much better off getting the contract done quickly, keeping a good relationship with whoever you're working with. And yeah, maybe it's 10% more expensive. You know, the quality of the work will have more dynamic range than that delta.
I feel like that's a key insight from the early days of startup. I think is super applicable today. And I think another aspect that kind of led you to TandemLaunch, and maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, is this proximity to academia. Having spun off 2 successful startups from UBC, I'd love to hear and understand kind of like the early days of how this embryo of like, hey, you know what? Universities are thinking 5-10 years ahead. Everyone else is thinking, 1 to 3 quarters ahead. How did you develop this into a company like TandemLaunch?
Yeah, this was a bit of a journey. It's not that there was one sort of big idea. There were multiple kind of genesis moments during my journey. So the first one definitely was just being part of spinning out Sunnybrook, that first venture, which very much in those early days was a true classic academic spin out, right? It was a professor, a postdoc, myself, the three of us were all from that lab. We're creating this company, and it was, very much a researchy kind of thing. And what I realized there is two things. One, academia has a ton of interesting technology that really have great potential. But two, it's really, really hard to spin out companies out of academia. Very, very, very difficult. And most of these attempts fail. The tools aren't there, the capital isn't there, the team dynamics aren't there. And we actually split that company into two, into one half becoming Brightside later, in part to get it to look like a company rather than just an extension of an academic lab. So the Signebook technology ultimately kind of stumbled, and then it was, it took a long time before it got back into, it's now a company again. It's doing quite well, but there was a long journey in between where it was really just a lab project for a long period. And I realized that, it's very easy to get captured in that process. And so that, taught me to really get stuff out of academia into a company environment very quickly. Then Brightside, taught me, we started that. We pulled it out into a company, literally like moved it away from campus, created its own identity with its own team. And then I realized that there's an abundance of supply. So rather than just taking the technology from UBC, sort of in quotation mark, our own work, I brokered partnerships with 10 other universities, so 11 in total, to feed ideas and inventions into Brightside. So we had this huge mechanism of intake for ideas. And that became really powerful. In fact, a big chunk of the value of the company when we sold it, were those inbound, intellectual property components. And so now you're seeing the setup for TandemLaunch, right? So it's like, there's value in academia. To get it out, you have to pull it out. You can do lots of those. There's lots of supply. So why not create a business model that does that in a sort of industrial scale, right? Rather than building one company that sucks in stuff from 11 universities, why don't you break that up into multiple companies? Because one of the challenges in Brightside was that we'd acquired all this IP, and it started to stretch over multiple product areas. We had some display technology that Samsung wanted. We had some video and codec stuff that Dolby wanted. We had some camera technology that Sony wanted. And it's very hard to sell a company to three different players.
Because the business models are all different.
It's all different dynamics. And so we ended up, sort of negotiating a license with one side and an acquisition with the other. And we got lucky that Dolby kind of had a big enough pocketbook and was willing to say, what, we'll do all of that. We acquire all of it and then we'll parcel out the pieces ourselves because they were a big licensing company. But that was luck. And so I realized if I do this again, I need to find a way for each of these technologies to sort of have its own destiny and its own direction. And this is now the TandemLaunch model where we do the same thing, but fan them out into multiple companies.
And maybe give us a sense of the scale of TandemLaunch today, because I know that you're covering 8 years in a really short period, but there's some really powerful startups and brands that you guys have built, right, in this period of time. So I'd like to understand the scale of what you guys have built so far.
Yeah, certainly. So it's been a phenomenal journey with some great people, both great entrepreneurial leaders, executives, my own team. And we've come a long way from essentially zero. So as you mentioned, 8 years ago we started. Today, we have 25 companies, between them, about 10 of them, 9 or 10 have, about, at least above 25 million in market cap. So they're real Series A funded type companies. Probably have close to 500 people in the portfolio between all the various companies. Obviously very nonlinear distributed, where the older companies have most of it and the younger ones are still small, but, maybe about 150 million in venture capital has gone in, excluding us. So, this is real scale. There's, hundreds of people doing a lot of stuff in a lot of different ventures. And what I, find particularly powerful, it's not just, these are all stats that you can rattle off, but what I find fascinating is that the success rate of our portfolio is incredibly high. So, in 8 years, we had 2 or 3 write-offs, depending on how you want to account. So 2 ventures that we had to shut down. They both shut down at Incubating, which is sort of in here. And then the third one that it was a project before it even became a company that we shut down. So you can argue about that. But that's less than 10%. And over that timeline in a world of super early stage venture capital, Usually it's the other way around. 10% make it to Series A, not 10% die. And so it's been fascinating. Obviously, lots of challenges, lots of setbacks at the tactical level. But as a whole, all these companies are up and running, doing their thing. And that's, credit to exceptional leadership in all of them.
Yeah, it sounds like you said, your venture capitalist, it's almost like the wrong definition given the success rate, because it's like it's VCs tied to those exponential outcomes, right? Like the 1 for 10, and you guys, seems like your batting average is really, really solid.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very, very high. And I'm every year amazed by it. Every year, I mean, obviously I think all companies are awesome and I think they're doing wonderful things, but it's still startling that when you start the year, you go, okay, this year, a whole bunch of them just statistically have to die. And then at the end of the year, they're all still prospering and growing. Yeah.
I know one of the you mentioned business platitudes, right? It's like, okay, it all boils down to the people, but that's kind of true for everything. So outside of the people, what do you credit this high success rate, right? Is it the business model? Is it just the environment, the culture?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things. One thing that seems very powerful is sort of a positive loop effect that we get, where we can effectively level up all the pieces of a startup through their joint presence. So we build companies synthetically, right? So all the people, nobody really knows each other. They all come together here. And an interesting thing that does is that you can use the quality of some of the pieces that are there already to up-level the quality of the pieces that are still coming. By pieces, I mean now technology, people, a business plan, everything, right? And I think that's something that normal startups, organically formed, don't have, because what happens is, some guy meets another guy and goes, hey, let's do a startup together. Chances are, right at that moment, they're probably friends already. They probably know each other already. Like, people don't just randomly walk up, and they're probably of comparable caliber. Whichever way you define caliber, they're probably, of similar state in life, similar experiences, similar income potential, similar whatever, because otherwise they just wouldn't really work together, right? For us, it's very different. So for us, what happens is, so the universities trust us for some reason, basically earned record of success, to give us intellectual property that is really leading edge stuff, right? And when I say universities, I mean the top of the top, right? Stanford, Caltech, Columbia, University of London, some of the most successful universities in the world that really have other options, right? It's not like Stanford can't commercialize this stuff next door. Literally, Sand Hill Road is across the street, right? So they give us these technology assets. And that gives us really, really world-class concepts. And that ends up attracting technologists that are, again, world-class. And they also come from all over the world. So that Stanford technology is now attached to a venture called Wayflight, where Bahar, the technical lead, she was doing a postdoc at MIT after having done various degrees all over the world. She also has choice, right? She doesn't have to move to, nothing so far has any connection to Montreal. The technology, they all came here to work, but she wanted to work on this, right? And so then that allows us to bring in, great technologists. Great technologists attract great business leaders who also move from all over, gives us great, CEOs, experienced VP, all the kind of key executive roles. And so that then attracts really high profile investors. If you look at our blog, you will see even just in the last few weeks or last couple of months, we've had announcements led by financing rounds announcement led by Intel Capital, Bosch Ventures, Telefonica Open Futures. There's another few that are Quantenna, Qualcomm. There's very high tier investors who want to work with those CEOs, with those CTOs, with those universities. And that loop keeps going, right? Because that gives us successful ventures, and that encourages the universities to give us good stuff again. And so you're sort of leveling up the pieces during that cycle. Yeah.
It feels like you've built this unfair advantage of being able to obtain, IP. And when we were talking right before, it was you guys helped launch a machine learning startup in 2011 where people didn't even know what machine learning was or how to spell it. And so you have this ability to kind of see beyond the bend. So is that the continued impetus in terms of your strategy? In terms of your ambition is just do what you're doing now, just more fuel and more startups?
Absolutely, yeah. So we're scaling the organization. Scaling at TandemLaunch is a multi-layer thing. So continuously over the last 8 years, we've grown, if you want, the production rate of the factory. So the number of companies every year that we build has gone steadily, roughly by 1 per year. So when we started, we built like 1 at a time, then 2 at a time, 3 at a time. We're now at 7, maybe 8 at the time. So that is one type of growth. It's fairly linear because this is hard. This is not a model where you can just go, let's build 20, right? You have to actually have the ideas, the technology, the people. It's a very boutique kind of thing. But that's one level of growth. The second level of growth is because the survival and success rate of our company is so high, they're not dying. So the portfolio is growing by number of companies. So not only are we adding a handful or 6, 7 to them every year now, the other ones are all still around. And so that creates growth all by itself. And then the last one is that not only are our companies alive, they're overwhelmingly prospering and raising larger rounds and growing and scaling. I think in the last probably 6 months, we've probably, and the portfolio has probably raised more capital than the whole 7 years before that. So there's an exponential growth of all these companies. And all those effects compound, right? The portfolio is growing exponentially in terms of the individual companies are growing exponentially. The number of companies is increasing quite dramatically. And the production rate is increasing, right? And so all these things level up. And because we're not just a studio, because we also are a VC and we also invest and serve on the boards and follow these companies and help them grow, from a workload perspective, that means, all these growth factors hit us. And right now we're trying to scale up to meet all those demands, which is a non-trivial challenge.
Yeah, no, I can imagine, right? So it's like, scaling up your own operation at the same time. Do you see any pattern recognition across your startups, particularly at the earlier stage, in terms of like where they need the most help? Going back to, I really found that feedback loop to be quite interesting, right? So like, obviously AWS is really famous for, creating a commodity, which is, being able to like rack servers. It seems like you're approaching it at another layer, right? So like, imagine maybe a feedback loop of, customer acquisition, for instance, right? So one startup that's really good in doing customer acquisition can help another one that's just learning about it, right? So you're just curious, what specific areas do you see that loop playing the biggest role?
Yeah, so there's obviously tons of things that early stage startups could learn and do better at, including ours. In general, what we found to be the highest impact is this continuous up-leveling of the team. I think a lot of entrepreneurs make the mistake to build the companies up to their own capability, rather than up to the opportunity. And if you're lucky, your own capability exceeds the capability of the opportunity, and then you're the next Elon Musk or Steve Jobs or whatever, and it's all wonderful. But in most cases, that's not true. In most cases, and particularly it's not true when you have a more nuanced view of what capability means, right? Because capability isn't one thing. Your technical chops may be world class, but your managerial chops are not. Right. And a lot of startups then make the mistakes to say, well, I'm an okay, but not a great manager. So I'm going to keep my team size to what I can comfortably manage. And my company therefore becomes a 12 people company just because that's what I can handle. That's leaving a lot of value on the table. It may not even be the death of the company. It may be okay, but it's not great. And so one of the things that we're trying to instill in our portfolio from the get-go, and by the nature of the way we build companies, is this sort of sense of like continuously up-leveling, continuously upgrading your team, your board, your investor base, your executive organization. Just keep building. Because at the end of the day, you want to do the company opportunity justice, not your own sort of particular set. And of course, if you're a great technologist but not a good manager, just hire a program manager or a VP Eng that becomes your peer. And so you do the architecture, and the other person does the management. It doesn't mean that you don't have a role to play. But it does mean you want to build the organization around you rather than below you all the time.
Yeah, it's fantastic advice. Like, I'm taking notes. I think I'm going to try and instill this in my company. Going back to, it seems like you have so many different companies. Your time must be spread so thin. How do you prioritize your own agenda?
That's a hard one. So part of the answer is just I work a lot of hours. That's in this day and age, you're not supposed to say this. It's become sort of popular to say like work-life balance and all that kind of stuff. And I do have a family. I have 2 kids, so I don't work 100 hours a week. But there is an element of it. I work a lot of hours. And I think that's, if you want to be an entrepreneur and you don't want to put the hours in, like no self-help book on the planet is going to help you, right? At the end of the day, this is a hard job. that said, what I try to do is exactly that dynamic range assessment that I said before. Like one of the big benefits we have, without which our whole business model wouldn't work, pretty much all of our CEOs are seasoned operators who've been there, done that, right? Most of them, pretty much all of them have had at least 1 or 2 exits under their belt. They've been there, done there. And so, it's rare for me to get sucked into operational details in the companies. Whereas in the incubation program early on, before all this is in place, we get sucked into operations all the time, right? And so that allows us really to even reach this level of scale because, right now I'm sitting on, I don't know, 13, 14, 15 boards. I don't even count them, but, that's just in the portfolio. And then I serve on like another 6 boards outside in terms of other stuff. That would be surreal if I actually were to get involved operationally. So fortunately, by working with people who have a certain scale, you can really focus on strategy, rather than getting sucked into the logistics.
Yeah. So you come in kind of like this like chess grandmaster that's seeing 13 different chessboards and you kind of say, hey, you need to move your peon this way. So, I think that's a pretty good analogy of
it's a very generous analogy, but I'll take it.
So I guess to zoom out a bit, I guess you're looking at a bunch of different technologies, and I'm sure that you have you're kind of interested in a lot of different commercial applications. Are there any in particular right now that are piquing your interest?
Yeah. So as you mentioned earlier, our job is really to forecast the future, right? So we are way off from the traditional VC sort of universe. Most VCs, unfortunately, spend much of the energy investing on what's hot right now, which inevitably is not going to work, right? That's also why the VC industry generally loses money. You want to, catch the crest, the valley of the wave, not the crest.
Yeah.
And so right now we're not really looking into a lot of the stuff that's hot, and that the world thinks is hot. We're looking at the stuff that will be hot in 3 years from now, 5 years from now. So in terms of those areas, one area that we're really interested in is, sort of clever new ways to sensing information. We are, right now what is hot, what is definitely at its crest is, AI. Everybody believes in data science, deep learning, whatever name you want to give to it. And while there certainly are some key advances in that area, I think the next breakthrough that sort of attaches to this is actually getting data, getting advanced sensors, getting communication for those data. So if you look at some of our companies, so Wavelight, for example, they figured out a way how to do wireless communication for IoT devices, without requiring power. So in a world where you need data from everything, you need sensors everywhere. The biggest bottleneck is that the sensors consume power, and that means batteries, and that means it doesn't work, right? So if you can do communication without power, it means you can do sensors without power. You can put, 50 thermometers or 50 pressure sensors or whatever into every room here, and they will last forever and they will just be there, right? So that's an example of where we think the next wave is going to catch. We have other StrataSense being into chemical sensing. Aerial uses Wi-Fi to sense motion patterns. CoralWave uses Wi-Fi to sense biosignals out of the human body. So that's a big area for us. Smart sensors in a very broad bucket, or the enabling technologies for it. Another area that we have a strong interest in is robotics. We have a number of companies, C2RO being one, that are in, not necessarily in the building of robots, but creating an infrastructure or creating technology for a world where robots will be quite common. And I say robots in a broad sense, right? Autonomous vehicles, UAVs, drones, you name it.
So you said 3. So you said sense information robotics to another area, or?
Yeah. So the other one is advanced materials. Okay. We believe that, just like there were sort of, there were 3 sort of big breakthroughs in the last 20 years when it comes to startups. So the first one obviously was, the internet, the cloud, all this kind of stuff, which made software startups very efficient. Then there was sort of, additive manufacturing, smart outsourcing, contracting, Kickstarter, which created a wave of kind of what I would say basic hardware, startups that prospered quite well. And I think our bet is that the next big wave that's going to hit is on materials. So actually materials moving from being the domain of, giant companies with billion-dollar factories to the domain of something you could do. And we have a few plays, Aura being a good example. They built, graphene oxide speaker membranes, and they actually have a $1 million Kickstarter, and they have the membranes ready. made here, produced locally, out of its materials, but it's done literally in this building, it's quite impressive. That just wasn't possible even 5 years ago.
Yeah, interesting. So, like for instance, like a shirt that its texture will adapt to the temperature outside, for instance, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, what you do with those, there's lots of interesting applications. There's those kind of applications. The key is that we believe that in the next 5 years, next 3 years, really, scale manufacturing of smart components, both R&D thereof, developing thereof, manufacturing thereof, is possible for startups. And that means we're looking at a lot of interesting technologies that, if that becomes true, can become real strong businesses by doing smart adaptive components and materials.
Are there any technologies that you feel are underrated today or not capturing enough attention?
Well, materials is one, right? So if you look at our layout, so we're looking at the three examples I just gave, right? So if you look at a normal VC, some more enlightened VCs, I think will already do exactly what we're doing, which is investing into the future. But a lot of them, invest in deep learning, whatever, voice something. We did that too, except we did that 5 years ago, right? I think that space has sort of run its course. Those companies are real. They're doing well and they will continue to do well, but they're in the market now. They're producing, right? It's a question of, do you want to start newcomers in that field? Yeah. So instead of focusing on AI applications as a first wave, we're now looking at things like sensors or robotics, which are basically either use cases, enablers or use cases of AI, right? We're trying to move one further on that stuff. Whereas the materials side, we think is going to be sort of the next frontier of doing interesting things. Yeah.
So you're moving beyond the screen down to physical manifestation of all these digital technologies,
correct,
which kind of brings back you full circle to working on hardware, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah.
Which is pretty interesting. Helge, I want to be respectful of your time. It's been extremely interesting. I guess one last question would be: where can people find out more information about what you guys are doing?
Sure, they can come to our website at TandemLaunch.com. Follow us on social media, but the other easiest option is just shoot me an email, and I always reply.
Super cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Point of No Return podcast. Never miss an episode by clicking on the subscribe button on iTunes or Google Play.